Alicante, the southern Spanish province, is home to a rich culture, Mediterranean sunshine, and approximately 76,000 Brits, the most of anywhere in the country. Until January this year, if they'd been living abroad for over 15 years, they couldn't vote in general elections in the United Kingdom. But now, many of the expats here will be some of an extra 2 million people worldwide who will have a say about which party will form Britain's next government. The end of the so-called 15-year rule has created a whole new constituency of its own. But how will politicians reach out across the oceans, across the mountains, to capture those votes? In the first international edition of Westminster Watch, we've come to Javier, a coastal town in the province of Alicante, to see how voters look at the government in Britain and if they will vote at all. Expats make up nearly half the population here, and Brits make up most of that. So how connected do they feel to the goings-on in Westminster? One man who's tuned into the community is Cal Sutherland, or as he's known to his listeners in Javier, Cal in the afternoon.
For an hour two, the Bay Radio Superstar Sounds of Spain.
He's presented his show on Bay Radio for 17 years. Cal, it's a pleasure to be here at Bay Radio, and with you particularly because you've been very connected with voters for a long time in this area, including those who weren't able to vote because they've been here for over 15 years, can now vote. The question I've got for you is, do you think they can even be bothered to vote, these expats?
I think it's probably come at just about the right time, because generally I think after a few years people don't really think too much about home. Really depends on their own personal situation, but you know, you get dragged into the life here and you know, you enjoy it, and perhaps that kind of fades into the distance. But you know, with the situations that we've had in recent years, you know, with Brexit and the pandemic, that certainly focused people on what's going on in their lives, and as we've seen, it's changed a lot in the way that people move around the world. And we've
well,
seen
that's interesting.
Here.
Let's just dig into that a little bit more, because all the turbulence that's been going on, let's call it what it is, particularly over the last 5 years, post-Brexit environment, have actually expats got more connected with what's going on in politics in the UK, or just switched off? They've had enough.
Yeah, I think you'd have to say the pandemic really, Brexit first of all, then the pandemic really did it. People got a lot more engaged with what's happening back at home than they perhaps were prior to that. You know, there was quite a lot to be said about Brexit, but of course at that point people who've been here for more than 15 years couldn't vote. And would that have swung it, Nick? I mean, I don't know.
Well, who knows? But what we do know is that the election is on July the 4th. So are you aware of any attempts by politicians to reach out to the expats, or even reach out to you, Cal?
We've certainly not seen anything like that at all. So it's really, I think you're probably the first to come and put questions to people about their voting intentions.
Well, guess what? We've actually got a politician to reach out to you and join me here in the studio in Bay Radio on Westminster Watch, and that is, of course, Sir Geoffrey Clifton Brown. Sir Geoffrey Clifton Brown, welcome to Westminster Watch, live from Javier here in Spain. I'm with Cal Sutherland, of course, and he is very much in touch with the expat community here in Spain. He's a broadcaster with Bay Radio. So let me crack on. January, the law came in extending the franchise to now almost every expat at roughly about 3 million so that they can vote. You've had a long campaign, a lot of effort into this. Why was it so important to you?
So the importance of it is that it isn't just limited to 15 years. It's all those that have been connected with the UK. They've had an address in the UK. They've had a polling station where they voted, can now vote for life. And that's the really important thing. The 15 years was an arbitrary cutoff. Now, at the last election, there were about 275,000 people voted. At this election, registered rather, at this election, we think it'll be up to about 600,000.
That's still not an entirely huge turnout, given that there's 3.2 million who are registered. Do you think you can do any more, or the parties can do any more to improve turnout?
Well, we have encouraged the Electoral Commission to actually use every avenue they can to publicise the availability of this. I think a lot of people don't even realise that we have this facility of votes abroad. And when you think that in France, Ireland, they have a minister entirely to looking after people who are living abroad, and America, it's hugely important, the votes abroad. I think that Britain still lags a long way in this, and we could do more to promote it.
There would be critics in the UK who would say that if you've had nothing to do with your country for 15 years, having chosen to leave, why should you have a stay and an extended lifetime franchise? What would you say to them?
Well, I think this is a slightly old-fashioned view, if I may say so, because what it used to be was people going to various parts of the world to retire and perhaps only coming back to this country in the last few years of their life. Now what you're seeing is professionals, more and more professionals, actually coming and going from the UK. They might be a little time in the UK, they might be a little time in their country of origin, they might go to a different country of origin. So I think there's a lot more transience in the world than there ever used to be. And I think those people who've spent time in Britain actually tend to be very loyal. And I don't know, Cal, your people you've talked to in Javier, I wouldn't be surprised if they're not tuning into some sort of British media or program on a fairly regular basis.
That certainly is the case. I think the average age now is around 55. So what you're saying is exactly that. They are working, a lot of them working abroad, and up and going backwards and forwards.
And therefore, if they're working, they're probably using British services. They're probably paying taxes to the British taxpayer. I think they have every much of a right to vote as people living in the UK.
So, Geoffrey, you got this through Parliament in the nick of time with the general election on July the 4th. What plans are you aware of, and you can only speak for the Conservative Party, of course, to reach out to voters and make them part of this campaign?
Well, clearly we've got groups around the world, anywhere where there is a significant number of British expats or people likely to register to vote abroad. And for those people, we will be firstly encouraging them to register to vote, and then secondly, sending them digital pieces of information, because clearly the idea of trying to post things around the world in a 5-6 week election campaign is A, very expensive, and B, not practical.
What would you say to Cal to try and reach out to voters to encourage them to vote Conservative at the next general election on July the 4th?
Well, the first thing I would say is go on the gov.uk site and actually register to vote. When you've got your vote, then please consider very carefully how you are going to vote, and hopefully vote Conservative. You are obviously deeply interested in the United Kingdom, not only for yourselves, but for your family, your children, your grandchildren, about how the future of the UK progresses. You will know the political issues. You will know that our economy is strengthening after the dreadful pandemic and the inflation caused by the war in Europe for the first time since the Second World War in Ukraine. These have had devastating effects on our economy. Large parts were shut down during the pandemic. They're now beginning to come back quite strongly. And what I would say is the Conservatives have a plan to make every single person in this country better off, make sure the country is properly governed, and make sure that we deal with immigration in a fair way.
Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown, thank you very much for joining myself and Cal here on Westminster Watch from Javier. Sir Geoffrey's worked to get rid of the barriers to voting that have plagued expats for years. But is regaining the right to vote enough to motivate those who haven't had their say in a UK general election for over a decade? Both Kate and Stephen have lived here in Javier for over 15 years. I joined them for a game of paddle and a chat about what the changes to overseas voting mean for them. Time out, everyone. Great game. Thank you. I did enjoy that. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Kate. Now, I think we should drop the paddle for the politics. You've been living here, both of you, for a long time. Finally, the vote has been extended to every expat. July the 4th, the election. Let me just start with you, if I may, Kate. What I'd like to know is, when you look at British politics from afar here in Spain, what do you think of the state of politics?
I think that it's a little bit of a mess. I think that things are going to change after the vote in a big way.
So you're buying into the Keir Starmer mantra already of change. You think it's time for a change?
I think it's time for a change. I'll say that.
Stephen, likewise, long-term resident here in Spain. You've got the vote back. July the 4th is election day. But when you look across the sea back to England, what do you think of the state of politics there?
It doesn't really matter who wins, because the problems in the country are so deep. Really, whoever comes in or whoever stays or comes in has got the same job and the same problems to deal with. They're not going to change.
Well, let me ask you, you are now one of over 3 million expats. That is nearly 5% of the electorate. Do you feel that this is a responsibility now that you are actually looking forward to exercising?
Not really, because there are as you said, there's between 2.8 and 3.2 million who can now vote. That represents something like 33 constituencies. So if they were to have constituencies for overseas voters, yes, it would make a difference. But at the moment, our vote here, one, it's not particularly important because it's so diluted throughout the whole population. And two, no one really cares because in the end, as I said, it's diluted through the population and it doesn't really affect it.
Do you feel it's a civic duty to vote, Kate?
I think that it's nice to have our right back to vote. We have a voice. I think that's more important.
And has any British politician attempted to reach out to you at all as an expat?
No, not really. Not as an expat.
Let me ask you this. You sounded disenchanted, Stephen. What do you look for from British politicians when you go, or rather you send your vote, or you have a proxy vote for you on July the 4th, which is the entitlement of expats? Tell me, what are you expecting from a British politician?
I don't expect anything because we are, as I've said, such a small percentage of their constituency, and they're not going to lose their job because they upset somebody living in Spain or France or Germany, Australia or America. So they really aren't that interested in what we feel over here. Just look at the warm weather allowance. It's colder over here at night than it is in Britain, but they still cancelled it because it was politically sensible, well, financially better to do.
But will you vote? Because that sounds like you want to send a message just on that alone.
I will register to vote and then I'll decide, but we haven't really got an awful lot of time left to register and then vote.
Stephen, have you decided how you will vote yet?
If I'm going to vote, yes, I have.
Are you going to share that with us?
No, but I think you know, Nick.
Stephen and Kate have served up some interesting points that politicians back in the UK would do well to take note of. But do the other Brits on the streets of Javier agree? How do you feel about Brexit? Would it affect how you would vote if you did vote?
I did vote. I wasn't living in Spain or England at the time, but I think it's really sad that people can't come out here when they own houses here, and I think it's affected the cost of living in England too, and I think it's a really bad decision for England.
So do you know any people who were living here full time who've gone back home, Tim?
Yeah. I don't actually know personally, but I know there's lots of cases of that where they've had to go back.
And you know some people who were they residents here and they've gone back?
Well, they weren't residents here, but they had houses here.
Yeah,
and they can only come over in 90 days out of the 180 now.
Yeah.
Which I think is unfair. You know, they bought their houses and
What about the change in the law, Andy? That means if there was another referendum, all expats would have a say.
Yeah, and I think that's what should have been in place 8-9 years ago. It really frustrates me, and that's why I've got no interest in voting in this upcoming election. I think the passing legislation is too little too late, and I firmly believe, as an expat living in Europe, not just in Spain, if we've been allowed to vote in the referendum, that has had a bigger impact on our lives than any UK election.
Do you think, having not had the chance to vote in the referendum, it's actually a good idea not to vote this time round? Isn't that the point? Exercising your vote at least gives you your say?
I think I've lost confidence in the whole system, and that's why I'm not voting.
So, Tim, you're going to vote, but you haven't registered yet. Are you going to go home and register tonight?
Yes.
There you go, gov.uk. Keith, are you going to do the same?
The same.
And Andy, you're taking a positive step not to vote.
No, I'm not going to vote. I think when you have an MP and the Prime Minister in the Sunday Times rich list, there's something fundamentally wrong with politics.
I agree.
Historically, British citizens are a difficult audience for politicians to reach. Yet, even after regaining the right to vote, not everyone will be rushing to the ballot box in July. So, with millions of votes now up for grabs, how do political parties plan to win them? I took shelter from the sun to put this question to Tony Lawton from Labour International and Stuart Pallister from Lib Dems overseas. So, Stuart, what are you doing to try and reach voters now that so many more have got the opportunity to register and to vote?
Well, actually, since January, I mean, for several months now, we've been trying to communicate with people via digital channels, I mean, mainly social media, to get them to go to a website where we're explaining all the change in the regulations, basically, in the legislation. So hopefully we've pushed some along already to encourage them to go to the government website and register, but we're going to have to ramp it up now, basically.
And Labour, let's look at it this way. Are you now thinking, how am I going to not just get them to register, but actually to vote Labour?
Well, that's the problem. It's a bit like herding cats. There's a lot of voters out there, but we know from the figures that very few of the people who were already eligible to vote before this change actually voted.
About 20%.
I think it was actually less than that. I mean, I looked at there's a research paper in the House of Commons Library which I looked at this morning, which says that in the last election there were 230,000 people who registered to vote, but there's about 5 million people abroad, of whom about half would have been eligible before the 15-year rule changed, which is probably not much more than about one in 10. So yeah, so it's not a lot of people.
What are you finding is on the mind of expat voters?
Well, I've been keeping track of what expats are saying on social media sites, Brits abroad and so on. So there are a lot of issues, like mainly with the visas. It's a major issue. Residency visas, people wanting to come here. The 90 to 180 day rule, which we're campaigning actively to change. And those are the
do you think then it's those issues rather than looking back at what's been pretty chaotic in Parliament for the last 4 years or so? It's rather than those issues that are going to drive people's voting. It's what affects them as expats?
Well, I think those are contributory factors, because I think that factors like the NHS, social care, because if you've got elderly parents back in the UK, it's a major issue.
Let me be very blunt with you here. So, some people will say in Britain, look, you've been out of the country for an awful long time, well over the 15-year time period.
Yeah, I've been out of the country 40 years.
You have. And many will say, why should Stuart, why should Tony have the right to vote?
No, And so I sympathise with that. However, when it came to Brexit, I was not able to vote, and that's had a major impact on my life. So I would like to think that I can vote on issues that...
I think there's a very, very simple answer to that. The fact is, those who've retired and moved from Britain have an immediate... that what happens in Britain has an immediate impact upon them. The state pension, if they've got a personal pension, whether that goes up or down depending upon the stock market, interest rates on their savings.
It's interesting you said particularly that you had no say in the Brexit referendum. Looking at the voting record, it was actually the Lib Dems and Labour who did not want to extend the franchise. So do you hold them to account for that?
I thought the Labour Party's attitude the last time there was a vote on this, I don't know, about 4 or 5 years ago before this change, was pretty appalling. You know, I watched it on television and there were Labour MPs getting up saying, all these people who moved abroad, they've just gone there for tax reasons and things like that. Totally unsympathetic, but what they really meant was they thought that if this was changed, more would vote Tory than would vote Labour or Lib Dem. That's the truth of it.
No, I think you've probably hit the nail on the head there and where you stand at the moment. But look, you've talked about how life has changed since Brexit with some passion. Is that going to be a driver, do you think, to up those numbers of people who might register to vote, do you think?
Well, I hope so.
But do you think there's time? We've got an election on July the 4th.
I think it is, it's going to be difficult time-wise, quite frankly. And we have been actively doing it for several months, as I mentioned, in terms of trying to raise awareness about voter registration. And it's a lengthy process as well. Yeah. I mean, I applied to the local council, they couldn't find my details. And there's stories about people having to swear affidavits.
Yeah. It's going to be I think very difficult to persuade a lot more people to register in the short time we've now got. And the
what was it like in 2019?
2019, it was very difficult then. Very difficult then. But people are now saying, well, of course, you've now got all these people who've been here more than 15 years. That's going to make a massive difference. I don't think it will. It doesn't mean that...
Well, it could make a difference in marginal seats, though, in key marginal seats.
All right, okay, well, perhaps I can come back to that. But the fact is that even if you double the number of Brits who are able to vote, it doesn't mean the number who register to vote will double, because an awful lot of those people have been away from Britain so long they've lost touch with any constituency, so it's going to be very, very difficult for them to be able to register and get through the hurdles that you have to get through to do so. Secondly, there's an awful lot of Brits. I've spoken to many here, and you say, how long have you lived away from Britain? And they've said 30, 40, 50 years.
Exactly.
They've lived in Africa, they've lived in Hong Kong or wherever.
We're getting pressed for time, and I think a really important question to ask you. Are you getting any support from your political parties to reach the vote? Have you had any MPs contact you? Is anyone going to say we're going to come and talk, for example?
Yes, I'm sorry. They occasionally come overseas and they do tours and so on. Up to now, we've had mainly digital video Q&As with them, so sessions.
So they're making some effort.
Yeah.
Some effort, but we are trying to coordinate now.
Do you want more?
There is. Yeah, I think more effort, but there is Labour does have a system for dealing with this. We do have through Labour International the ability for anyone who's having difficulty in registering to have people who will assist them in doing that, and also to put them in touch with a particular constituency where they might want to apply for a proxy vote. And they might not know anybody, but they may be able to put them in touch with someone who can act as a proxy vote, because it's probably a waste of time voting by post if you live in Spain. Because by the time you get your paper, by the time you get the vote, it may be too late to send it back.
Tony, Stuart, we could go on for hours. Very lively discussion. Thank you very much for joining us here on Westminster Watch here in lovely Javier. Thank you.
Thank you.
With up to 3.2 million expats eligible to vote for the first time in the July 4th general election, it's not clear that the parties have a plan on how to reach them. Despite the largest ever extension of the franchise, it's not at all clear whether voters will even register to vote, let alone vote at all. One thing that is certain, that the major political parties have to up their game if they are to persuade expats to back them. Thanks to all my guests joining me here in Javier for our first international edition of Westminster Watch on the Road. And if you want to tune in to more lively debate, don't forget to check out our website, TRT World. In the meantime, from all of us and the team here at Westminster Watch, thank you for watching.